pretty early in President Biden's presidency, February the 4th, 2021, he spoke at the State Department about his priorities in foreign policy. And he said that one of those priorities was reclaiming our credibility and moral authority. The Prime Minister of Israel is, in the judgment of the Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, a war criminal. Isn't posting an alleged war criminal in the Oval Office undermining of credibility and moral authority?
No, because we don't consider him a war criminal.
But the International Criminal Court does.
We don't agree, and as we've said before, we don't find the ICC's finding to be relevant or appropriate in this case. We don't find him to be a war criminal. He's an ally and a partner and a friend. Hey, everybody. As you all know, the President and the Prime Minister are meeting right now in the Oval Office. There's a lot on the agenda, but first and foremost, we'll be discussing how deeply and how strongly the President feels, we feel, that we've got to get this hostage deal in place so we can get a ceasefire also in place, at least for phase one, for that those first 6 weeks. There are gaps that remain, and our team continues to work with our counterparts in the region to see if we can't close those gaps. We believe that they are of a nature where they can be closed and that we can achieve a deal. But it's going to require, as it always does, some leadership, some compromise, and an effort to get there. The President will be reaffirming for Prime Minister Netanyahu that he believes we need to get there, and we need to get there soon. Today is the 293rd day that these hostages have been held captive by Hamas. And you just have to assume that it is the most horrific of circumstances. Sadly, we know that not all of them are alive. Still hostages, still need to get home to their families. 293 days, there ought not to be a 294th. And we're going to keep working on that. I do anticipate that the two leaders will also have a chance to talk about other substantive issues in terms of the blue line up at the north and making sure we don't see an escalation of the conflict between Israel and Lebanon, and make sure that we're providing opportunities for both Israeli and Lebanese citizens to return to their homes, as well as, of course, the critical need for stability in the West Bank. We're still seeing violence in the West Bank that the President has been absolutely steadfast calling out as unacceptable. They'll also discuss the United States' ironclad commitment, of course, to Israel's security, including countering the very serious threats that Iran and its proxy groups continue to demonstrate throughout the region. The President and the Prime Minister, of course, after their meeting today in the Oval, will have a chance to meet with families of the Americans that are being held hostage by Hamas. This will be this President's second in-person meeting with these families. But as you all know, we have kept up a regular drumbeat of interaction with them. Since the 7th of October, Jake Sullivan's met with them 10, 12 times, something like that. And other members of the team have also kept in touch with them to make sure that they know everything that we're doing to get their loved ones home. Just quickly, before we go to questions, a quick word on Venezuela. We support the peaceful elections that we expect and hope will come on Sunday. Elections that will reflect the will and the aspirations of the Venezuelan people for a more democratic, stable, and prosperous future. Any political repression and violence is unacceptable. And of course, regardless of who wins, we encourage both candidates to commit to a peaceful outcome and to work together for the good of all Venezuelans. For that,
go ahead, Zeke.
Thanks, John. First, in light of the President's meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu right now, does the President believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to get a hostage deal, that given his political consideration at home in Israel, that he's actually capable and willing to bridge those gaps that you say remain?
Yes, yes, and yes. He has said so publicly himself, Zeke. He wants to get the hostages home. The Israelis, the government, Prime Minister Netanyahu, has been working with us to try to get that deal over the finish line. That said, as I mentioned at the top, there's still some gaps that remain, and we're going to be talking to the Prime Minister today about closing those gaps.
On a broader note, the President mentioned last night that he plans to spend the next 6 months in his time in office focused on some foreign policy issues. How does the President's announcement change what the White House, what the NSC has planned for the balance of the year through January 20th in terms of leadership by the president, travel by the president when we get to Africa? What were the to-do list of things that maybe had been planned for the second term that he now has less than 6 months to get done?
Well, look, now that that he's not running for re-election, certainly you can expect that there'll be opportunities on the calendar that may not have been before, and so we're all exploring what those opportunities can look like in terms of advancing his foreign policy agenda and national security opportunities here and around the world. But I don't have anything on the schedule to speak to now. But I mean, stay tuned. I think there'll be some opportunities that the president is going to want to explore. Look, I mean, still got a war in Ukraine, still got a war in Gaza, still got climate change to deal with. Still got a very restless Indo-Pacific. I mean, I could go on and on. There's plenty of things for the national security team to try to continue to get done.
John, we heard from the Vice President earlier with comments, strong comments as related to the vandalism and the protests that we saw yesterday. We haven't heard yet from the President or for the White House at large. Do you condemn what you saw yesterday? How do you characterize the protests, including what we saw at Union Station?
Well, we did put out a statement last night from the White House, but absolutely condemn any violence in protest activity. I mean, it's a First Amendment right to peacefully protest. We fully support that. We know that there are strong views about what's going on in Gaza, and some of those views are in opposition to some of the policies that we're pursuing. We get it. That's democracy. But when it turns violent, and when you burn an American flag and pull it down off a U.S. government site, that's just absolutely unacceptable. And obviously we condemn all that.
Are these protests pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas, anti-Israel? How do you characterize what we're seeing?
I think it's a little bit of all those things. I mean, I can't speak for the protesters. Obviously, I don't share their views. But obviously they took great exception to the Prime Minister speaking on Capitol Hill. And as I said, many of them have taken exception with our policies with respect to Gaza.
Today we heard from one of the family members who's going to be meeting with both the Prime Minister and the President a short time from now, Aviva Siegel. She was a former hostage of Hamas. She says, I want to ask President Biden if Bibi is not able or willing to agree to the ceasefire and hostage deal to bring the Americans home. Is there anything more that President Biden is prepared to do unilaterally to try to bring those hostages home?
I wouldn't get into hypothesizing and speculating about options one way or the other. We want to get all the hostages home, clearly the Americans in particular. And that's why this deal is so important, Peter. And we are close. We are closer now, we believe, than we've been before. The gaps are closable, no question about that. And we believe, the President believes, that getting that hostage deal in place, getting that 6-week ceasefire, that's the best way to get all these loved ones back with their families.
Thank you, Kareem. Thanks, John. Did the U.S. find any of Netanyahu's remarks yesterday to be false or misleading?
I'm not going to parse everything he said or do a fact check here from this podium. He should speak for himself about what his views are.
He should, but he had a powerful stage, a joint address before Congress. Do you agree with assertions that Iran financially backs some of the protesters, that if there are Palestinians in Gaza who aren't getting enough food, it's not because Israel is blocking it, as 2 examples?
So on the first example, we've said ourselves, the Director of National Intelligence came out publicly and said that we do know that Iran has been funding and encouraging some of the protest activity here in the United States. Some of it. We do not believe that all the protest activity out there on a daily basis is being fully funded by Iran. There's a lot of organic concern out there in the American people about what's going on in the Middle East, and most of these protests are formed and fashioned in that regard. On the second question, there has been a steady increase of humanitarian assistance getting into Gaza. The problem isn't getting it to Gaza right now. The problem is getting it around Gaza. And one of the reasons why it's so dang difficult to move things around inside Gaza is because there's a war going on and bombs are dropping. And regrettably, in the conduct of some of their recent operations, the Israeli military has, in fact, not on purpose. We have no reason to believe they did this deliberately, but there has been accidental strikes on some of the trucks and the convoys that have been moving around. So it's not one or the other. There's a lot of reasons why it's not moving around, and some of that is, of course, the military activity of the Israelis inside Gaza.
And then, now that the vice president is the likely Democratic nominee, has she communicated with the president whether a Harris administration's Israel policy would be the same or different as his?
You would have to talk to the vice president's office and the campaign for that. I would just, before we leave that though, just want to remind, she's been a full partner in our policies in the Middle East, particularly with our policies towards Israel and the war in Gaza, a full partner. Been involved in nearly every conversation that the president has had with the prime minister, and very much engaged throughout.
Okay, before I get to my questions, can I just a quick follow-up on that? Can you explain to the American people who might think it just looks odd that she is having her own private meeting with the prime minister separate from the president's that suggests that they aren't speaking with one voice?
I reckon if she was here, she'd be in the room right now, but she's not physically here. There's nothing unusual about that. And Vice President has, and I fully expect over the next 6 months will continue to have meetings of her own with foreign leaders. She's met privately with President Zelensky as well and others.
It was 20 days ago that the administration first said that they were really optimistic about really closing the deal. Has nothing changed in 20 days? Is that still where we are?
I wouldn't say nothing's changed.
What are the remaining gaps? What are the sticking points?
Yeah, I'm not going to negotiate in public. I wouldn't say nothing's changed. I mean, there's the last 20 days that you talk about, and we've been working really, really hard to try to get those gaps closed. There's still more work to be done. But we believe, as I said earlier, we're closer now than we've been before, and we think it's absolutely achievable to get this over the finish line.
Sort of following up on Weij's point, there's one other thing that the Prime Minister said yesterday that's getting a lot of attention is that the conflict has had one of the lowest ratios of combatant to non-combatant casualties in the history of urban warfare. Obviously, our own State Department has found it reasonable to assess that the Israelis' actions at times have been inconsistent with international law. So who is correct here? And is the United States comfortable with the ratio of deaths between
Again,
combatants?
I'm not going to go line by line through the Prime Minister's speech and debate it here from the White House podium. He should speak for his comments. He should speak for his views. What I can do is speak for ours. And the right number of civilian casualties is 0. And there has been too many civilian casualties in this fighting in Gaza. And as I just indicated in my previous answer, there continue to be civilian casualties in this war in Gaza. There continues to be desperate need for food, water, medicine, because it's a combat zone in many places. And we need to bring the war to an end. And one of the principal things that the president's going to talk to the prime minister about today is how we get there. How do we end this war? And the best way, in his view, is to get this deal in place. Get a 6-week ceasefire. Get phase 1 going so you negotiate to phase 2, get a cessation of hostilities, and more critically, get those hostages home.
Thanks, Karine. Thanks, Admiral. You mentioned in your topper the word compromises. Does the President believe that, specifically, that Prime Minister Netanyahu needs to make compromises to achieve a ceasefire deal? Then it's not just Hamas. And also, what are those compromises that Netanyahu would have to make? If so?
Both sides have to make compromises, and because we still have gaps that haven't been closed, I think you can surmise from that there are still compromises that need to be made. The Israelis already have made many compromises to get us to this point. Hamas, through their interlocutors, have made compromises to get us to this point, and yet we're still not there. So there's still a need for compromise.
And will the President be saying to Prime Minister Netanyahu, you need to make compromises?
Well, we're going to do a readout, and we'll tell you how the meeting went after it's over. But as I said in the opening statement, this will be a prime topic of discussion, that it's time now to get these compromises in place. It's time now to get the negotiation in place and get the hostages home. It's time to end the war.
Thank you. How does the administration reconcile the comments that the president has made about the fact that Hamas has been decimated, its military objectives achieved, as he said some weeks ago, and the fact that we heard the prime minister again reiterate that he wants total victory? How do you all reconcile those two visions?
I don't think they need to be reconciled. I think both things can be true. We do believe that from a military perspective, Hamas has been very, very badly beaten and denigrated. No question about that. Doesn't mean they've been eliminated. They still have leadership in place. They still can direct operations. They still have fighters at their beck and call. And we're seeing that every day. And we also still believe that they need to be defeated, that the threat to Israel needs to be eliminated from Hamas, and that whatever the post-war situation looks like, it can't end with Hamas being in control over Gaza. So I don't think that the two things are necessarily irreconcilable or at odds with one another.
Thank you. Two questions. To what extent the war in Gaza has impacted the President's ambitious project IMEC corridor, and is I2U2 being discussed today in the bilateral meeting?
For the IMET corridor, I think it's too soon to know whether there's going to be a big impact on that. The president's absolutely still committed to it. We've still got the teams pulling together and working on that. It's got great promise for infrastructure and investment opportunities across that whole corridor, not only just for the movement of commerce, but the jobs that it will create just in its establishment.
And secondly, President's another key initiative has been the Quad. Right? Is President still committed to attending the Quad summit being hosted by India this year?
We're still committed to there being a Quad Leaders Summit this year, but there's nothing on the calendar right now for it.
Thank you. John, the meeting with the hostage families this afternoon that you referenced, can you just give us a sense of what message the President and Prime Minister want to bring to those families? What are they going to say?
I won't speak for the Prime Minister, but the President intends to tell them how seriously he's still committed to getting this deal in place and getting their loved ones home. He's going to tell them that we're going to maintain the contact with them that we have had, that there's not going to be a gap in communication as we get closer here, hopefully to the end, and then he's not going to rest until all their loved ones are back.
The pool was in the Oval Office briefly for the beginning of their meeting, and the two men were friendly and cordial, and President Biden was joking about how old he was when he first had a meeting with a previous prime minister. But we know that there have been tensions between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Biden. Can you talk a little bit about the state of their relationship right now?
It's a healthy relationship. And by healthy, I mean they're not going to agree on everything. They haven't. They haven't, through the long political lives that both of them have enjoyed, always agreed on everything. They come from two different political traditions. But they know one another. I believe, I know I'm speaking for President Biden, that he's very comfortable in the relationship that he has with the Prime Minister and the ability that he has. He would do it anyway, but certainly with Prime Minister Netanyahu, the ability that he has to be candid and honest and lay it all out there, and he'll do that today.
Did the President watch the Prime Minister's speech yesterday, or see anything that he?
I don't know if he watched it. I don't know that.
And you didn't? Do you have a sense of his reaction?
I don't.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
You're welcome. That was easy.
Venezuela. Do you think that Maduro has the ability to kind of fully rig the election, or do you think that it's more likely that he would just contest the results?
It's difficult to know exactly how this is going to play out, so I can't really answer that specifically. But the reason I mentioned it in my opening statement is to make it clear to Mr. Maduro that we're watching closely. They need to be free and fair elections, free of repression, free of voter intimidation. And again, no matter who wins, our expectation is that the winner is going to continue to look after democratic institutions in Venezuela.
So if the opposition does win, are you concerned about violence that might break out?
If we weren't concerned about the possibility, I wouldn't have mentioned it in the opening statement.
Thank you. Admiral, two questions on Iran. How is POTUS Biden going to deal with Iran? I mean, which aspects of dealing with Iran is he going to prioritize in the next 6 months in office? And which one of them would he be recommending to be POTUS Harris if and when she gets to the White House again? And my second
She's already at the White House. She's already a key partner in our foreign policy objectives.
And the Commander-in-Chief.
I would tell you that you're going to continue to see over the next 6 months the same focus by this administration and this team, which of course includes the Vice President, on holding Iran accountable for all their destabilizing activities, support to the Houthis, to Hezbollah, to Hamas, the merchant attacks that they're allowing the Houthis to continue to perpetrate, and that they're perpetrating themselves in the Gulf region, as well as their support to Russia and Russia's war in Ukraine. I could go on and on. We have sanctioned Iran some 600 different times just in the last 3.5 years of this administration, will continue to hold them accountable. That will be a steady focus for the president.
Israeli Prime Minister yesterday labeled those part of the protesters as Iran's useful idiots. What is the administration's method of dealing with them? I mean, what is it?
First of all, that's not a phrase we would use. As I mentioned, I think, to Peter's question, we know that Iran certainly has tried to meddle here. They've tried to sow discord. They've obviously contributed to some funding of some protesters, but I think to paint everybody with that brush is unfortunate and not an accurate reflection. Most of the protest activity here in the United States is peaceful. Most of it is, by the vast majority of it, is organic. It comes from people who have real concerns, and that's what a democracy is all about.
And do you agree with the with the Prime Minister's assertion that basically Israel is protecting U.S. Why is it sort of an overt criticism from a leader of an ally? And what does U.S. need protection from an ally?
I'm sorry, can you?
Yeah. Well, he said when Israel fights Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, we are fighting Iran. When Israel acts to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons, we're not only protecting ourselves, we're protecting you. So why does the U.S. need protection from an ally? Isn't U.S. doing enough?
It is clear that that Israel and the United States share a concern about Iran's activities, and the Prime Minister's not wrong when you're going after groups like Hezbollah or Hamas in this case particularly, or when we together try to defend each other against the Houthi missiles and drones that continue to fly. That is also because of the proxy nature of it, also countering Iran's activities. I mean, together, that's what allies and partners do.
Thanks, John. Just to take the long view of this, very early in President Biden's presidency, February the 4th, 2021, he spoke at the State Department about his priorities in foreign policy. And he said that one of those priorities was reclaiming our credibility and moral authority. The Prime Minister of Israel is, in the judgment of the Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, a war criminal. Isn't posting an alleged war criminal in the Oval Office undermining of credibility and moral authority?
No, because we don't consider him a war criminal.
But the International Criminal Court does.
We don't agree, and as we've said before, we don't find the ICC's finding to be relevant or appropriate in this case. We don't find him to be a war criminal. He's an ally and a partner and a friend.
Well, the Chief Prosecutor says that Israel does have legitimate war aims, of course, but the way Israel chose to achieve these in Gaza, namely intentionally causing death, starvation, great suffering, and serious injury to body or health of the civilian population, are criminal.
Is that a question? Because if it is, I've already answered it. We don't consider him a war criminal.
Good.
Thank you, Corinne.
Thank you. Yes, she called me.
I thought she said Jane.
Thank you very much.
That was Jenny?
Yeah.
My bad.
Thank you.
No, it's all good.
Thank you, Corinne, and thank you, John. I have two questions. Recently, American families who were victims of Hamas filed a lawsuit against the North Korea authorities in the U.S. federal court, demanding $1 billion in compensation from North Korea, claiming that North Korea was responsible because the weapons used by Hamas were weapons supported by North Korea. What is your comment on this?
Well, look, Mr. Kim continues to export military capability, and we continue to work with allies and partners and counterparts to hold them accountable for that. They're also exporting technology and weapon systems to Russia so they can kill innocent Ukrainians. We're going to continue to hold them accountable for that kind of behavior.
Also, second question, if Vice President Kamala Harris is elected the next president, will she continue the foreign policy keep going on between U.S. and South Korea, or
I am not going to speak for a hypothetical electoral outcome, and I'm certainly not going to speak for the vice president in this regard. You really should talk to her team and her campaign.
Okay, John.
Thanks, Corinne. John, the president has been pushing for a peace deal, a ceasefire, for weeks, if not months. Now that he has announced that he's not running for another term, how, if in any way, that complicates those efforts to reach a peace deal?
We don't believe it does. And in the conversations that we've been having in just recent hours, there's no reason to suspect that his decision not to run for re-election is going to have an impact on our ability to get the deal done. What's going to have an impact, as I said before, is leadership. Leadership on all sides and the ability to continue to compromise. We are close. We just have to finish it.
The president also last night spoke about his goals in his remaining 6 months in office. One of those goals is to get back those wrongfully detained Americans, people like Evan Gershkovich from the Wall Street Journal.
And Paul Whelan.
And Paul Whelan, exactly. The president has been described by some as a lame-duck president. Does it complicate those efforts to get back those wrongfully detained Americans?
I can assure you that we continue to work extremely hard at getting all the wrongfully detained Americans around the world, including those in Russia that we've been talking about, getting them home where they belong. They don't need to, there's no reason for them to be detained. The whole team is working on this around the clock. I can absolutely assure you that.
Thank you for the answer also on the last question. Yesterday, Netanyahu asked the U.S. to fast-track weapons in his speech. I'm wondering if the president is considering lifting his pause on the 2,000-pound bombs that the Israelis have requested.
No change to that policy at this time, and I would just add that that is the only shipment of the only type of weaponry that has been held up, that all the military security assistance that had been going to Israel continues to go to Israel. They are still getting the tools, the capabilities, and the weapons that they need for the fight that they're in.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Corinne. What conversations has President Biden had with Vice President Kamala Harris ahead of her meeting with the Israeli Prime Minister?
I won't speak to private conversations between the president and the vice president. I wouldn't do that on any given day, and I'm certainly not going to do it starting today. The vice president, I'm sure her team will give her a readout of how the conversation between the president and the prime minister is going right now, and that will, I'm sure, inform her conversation, but I'm not going to get more detailed than that.
And just second question, what additional pressure is the president willing to exert upon Netanyahu, just given that the framework, as my colleague mentioned, was just submitted about a few weeks ago and nothing has come of that?
The framework for the deal? I mean, my goodness, there's, I know we're not there yet, and I get that there's more work to be done, but think about what has happened since he laid that out on the 31st of May. We went from that framework proposal to getting the framework itself agreed to now by both sides. There's some haggling that's being done over some of the details. Some of that haggling has had positive result, and we have closed some gaps. There are still gaps that remain to be closed, as I said earlier, some details that need to be worked out. There's an awful lot of energy and effort being put into this, certainly by our team, but I go so far as to say by our counterparts as well.
Good, Jay.
Thank you, Corinne. I've got two questions, but first, can you tell me the backstory behind the nice bling you've got around your neck over there?
Well, and I had a chance to meet with some of the hostages' families myself back in December. And the father of one gave me this to wear, and I try to wear it as much as I can, just to remember that, again, 293 days they need to be home with their families. And since they're here at the White House, and this is going to be a prime topic of conversation, I thought it was appropriate to wear it today.
Does the president have one?
I don't know.
Okay, I've got two questions. Is it or is it not the U.S. government's position that UNRWA is complicit in terrorism?
UNRWA does some things that no other agency can do on the ground in Gaza. You and I both know that. Now, there has been an investigation done to some of their employees, and I understand that there's been some additional claims or charges against additional employees too that have been laid out there, but it's clear to us that UNRWA has taken this seriously. They fully investigated it. They eliminated the employment of those that they believe were involved in terrorist activities. It's absolutely unacceptable, not just to us, but it should be, and we believe it is. unacceptable to UNRWA. But UNRWA is still, and yes, I know we're not providing funding them now because of legislation, but I think it's important for people to know that there are things that can't get done without UNRWA's cooperation and support on the ground.
And the government's position is that those are claims and charges, right? Claims and charges.
Some of them have been verified because they did their own investigation, UNRWA did, and terminated some of those employees. So clearly, there was something to it.
My second question. Hezbollah has been firing thousands of rockets. At what point does that violate the president's don't warning?
We are working, as I said in my opening statement, to try to resolve the differences at and around the blue line. We haven't seen, although there has been firing back and forth across that blue line, we want to see that stop. We haven't seen it escalate into an all-out war here, and nor do we want that to happen, which is why we're working so hard diplomatically to try to find a solution. One of the things that the Prime Minister and the President will talk about today is what we need to do, what more do we need to do to stabilize the situation on the blue line so that families, both Lebanese and Israeli, can start to move back to their homes.
All right, let's let the Admiral go. Go ahead, Jerry. You have the last question.
Thank you, Kareem. Good afternoon, Admiral. The progress that you cite as it relates to sort of the phase one hostage and ceasefire deal, does that signal that there has also been progress in the day after post-conflict Gaza and sort of what that government looks like?
No, those are two different processes. I mean, when I'm talking about progress made and gaps that can be closed, I'm talking about the ceasefire deal itself, which, as you know, has two phases to it. Phase one gets you 6 weeks of a ceasefire and the return of the most vulnerable, but not all, but the most vulnerable of hostages. That's a separate process than what you call the day after, which is something, frankly, that Secretary Blinken's been working on since almost the day after October 7th in terms of trying to figure out with our partners on the ground, including the Israelis, but Arab partners, what does governance look like when the war is over, and how are the aspirations of the people of Gaza actually met by a governing body and a governing authority that has an interest in meeting their aspirations for peace and security.
How would you characterize that process right now?
It's ongoing, and still a lot of work is being done. I mean, if you want me to give it a report card, I can't do that, but I can tell you that Secretary Blinken, Jake Sullivan, the whole team is still very much dedicated to that.